ER doctors, nurses, professionals of Reddit. What is something you saw in the ER that made you say, how the hell did that happen? I saw a man being carted out of the ambulance and into the emergency room with both of his eyeballs popped out of his head and resting gently in each of his hands. He was not panicking or sedated, just sitting there patiently holding his eyeballs. First day in my med school ER rotation. Self-inflicted axe in the chest. Apparently he was chopping wood and it bounced back from a misstrike and lodged in his sternum. It wasn't deep but it stuck. My wife is an X-ray tech in the ER. She has seen some shit. But the worst thing she ever saw was a young couple after a car accident. Their heads smacked together, breaking both of their skulls. They were practically stuck together by their skull. They had to be surgically separated. I tell my dumbass friends who don't wear seat belts that I don't care if they survive an accident. I care that their head doesn't kill me when it gets turned into a projectile. I was an emergency room orderly Friday, Sat, and Sunday nights when I was in college. I guess the tops would be lady with a turn signal lever embedded in her skull from a car wreck, guy with half a head who attempted suicide with a shotgun and failed, girl sunburned so bad you could peel her skin and make another girl, emergency open chest heart massage, kid who fell into a campfire and his shirt was welded to his chest because it took a while for the folks to get him to the ER, and rodeo bullfighter with a hole in his stomach the size of a tennis ball where the bull gored him. Woman's hand sawed off at the wrist. Clean cut too. Self-induced. Obvious mental issues going on there. I heard she was able to get it sewn back on and regained most of the function back. That's incredible that she had function. I've always wondered, do you just say okay, connect this nerve to this etc. mean? I'm an engineer and I know I wouldn't be able to repair most man-made machines that way, and the human body is essentially the most complicated machine in existence. Surgeons have my utmost respect. Nurse here. I once took care of a man with multiple gunshot wounds and required major surgical operation. It was odd because the man was not the person you would expect for that kind of wound. He was in his 90s and I was expecting a younger man, thinking it may have been gang violence, but nope. He was shot in WW2 with a bullet that splintered in his abdomen. He had bullets stuck in him from the war but never had them fully removed. Which explained the heavy duty lead levels. Absolute miracle he lived as long as he did with all that. Probably the coolest patient I ever had. Nurse here. Had two brothers get into a fight over a girl. Wound up repeatedly stabbing each other. They are brought in and put on side by side stretchers. The amount of blood was incredible. I was just sliding in blood. I could not get any traction under my feet. How either one of them made it I'll never know. My wife is a former EMT. She tells me the worst call she was on was for a guy who had been shot with a .22 during a gas station robbery. The round had bounced around inside his chest, rupturing all kinds of stuff. She was pretty experienced by this point and could see the guy was in serious trouble, BP just crashing, so she tells the driver he has to move it or the patient is going to bleed out before they can get to the ER. By the time they get there the blood is sloshing around on the floor of the ambulance. And it pours out when they open the door. He did make it. Retired ER nurse here. Had a woman insert a coffee cup in her vag. Then went for a drive. She was hit head on with a motorhome. The cup broke inside of her. We ended up removing broken pieces of china from her vag. I got an order to do an X-ray on an ankle at 2 AM. I roll into the room and the man's foot is on backwards but nothing was broken. All the DR had to do was pull super hard straight down and it snapped back onto place like a rubber band. The story was he touched a stripper and the bouncer showed him who was boss. I'm still confused on the mechanics of any of this. An 8-foot long splinter of wood that had went through a man's dong and was dangerously close to his femoral artery. My cousin was a paramedic and told me a story about a lady that stuck a live lobster in her vag. The lobster apparently freaked out and flinched and uncurled its tail, causing it to get stuck in there. I don't understand why anyone in their right mind would think it's okay to shove a lobster up inside them. I mean, I don't understand the thinking behind any of these but vag stories. But this, just wow. Reading this. No wonder the ER reception don't give a shit when I come in for my back making unable to move. They probably think I am a ducking pussy or something for coming without half my body devoured by a bull shark while I was doing some weird crazy sick stuff. My mom worked as a receptionist for this doctor and he would often ask my mom to accompany him and other staff to this rural village in South Africa as part of giving back to the community. So one day this lady comes in and complains about her breasts hurting. So the doctor begins to examine her and underneath her breasts there are worms coming out of her breasts. People ran out of the room to throw up. She had to undergo surgery and they found many eggs, etc. Not a doctor, but the son of one. When I was 17 and exploring the various parts of the hospital, my dad brought me to intensive care and I saw a teenager that lost half his body. Upon further inspection, it turns out that he was actually bent 90 degrees in the wrong direction. I was so mortified. I couldn't register what my dad said happened to him. Not me. My brother while in med school. Guy walks into emergency room with the handle of a butcher knife sticking out from under one eye. They x-ray him and find that yes, the whole knife is there, sticking into his skull. X-ray and neurological tests indicate that he was really lucky. Knife didn't do any serious nerve or brain damage. After some debate, they decided to pull the knife out, but it's really stuck. Eventually they lay the guy on his back. ER doc takes off his shoe, climbs up on the gurney, puts his foot on the patient's forehead and heaves the knife out. They put the guy on the ward and the next morning the cops show up to ask him about it. Guy says, "Never mind. I'll take care of it." Next day while no one is looking, Guy gets up and walks out. For people who didn't show up for their yearbook photo, they substituted the x-ray of the guy with the knife in his head. Guy cheated on his girlfriend. She got him drunk and he passed out. She wrapped him and duct taped tighty whities real tight. He tried for 24 hours to get them off. Finally came to the ED. Skin was necrotic from lack of blood supply and ended up with multiple debridements in the oar. Won't ever be able to cheat again. Not a professional but worked as a volunteer in the ER reception area. Saw a guy come in stabbed with a cucumber. Nurse here. When I was a student I had a patient brought in from their care home with maggots in their trach, which is a hole in their neck the patient breathes through. The paramedics said they had suctioned around 100 maggots on the ride over. Next would have to be a woman who gouged out her own eye due to psychosis. She calmly walked into the ER and asked if someone was available to clean it for her. Teenager got in a fight with his brother. Of course both drunk and over a girl. Brother smashes a glass coffee pot and stabs dude in the neck. Sees blood and runs. Somehow he misses all the major vasculature in the neck. This was out in the bush. So I got to take this guy to the nearest major hospital with a trauma surgeon and vascular on standby. On the way, his mom calls and tells him he better not rat his brother out, has a record. They get in a shouting match and he starts thrashing around. I take the phone away from him and tell him to lie still unless he wants to die. More morphine given. Later, CT shows he was a cm away from having a carotid nicked and dying. I asked my mom who's a nurse this question and she said it's extracting roaches and other bugs from people's ears. Although that wasn't the worst part. The worst part is that it happens enough that there is strict procedure specifically for it. My boyfriend was the patient in one of these kind of stories. So, type 1 diabetes. 8-year-old boy who's had it since he was 5. Blood sugar got out of whack. Admitted to the hospital. Kid had been getting his fingers pricked and insulin injected for years. So nobody thought he'd have a problem getting an IV cannula in his arm. They were wrong. Apparently, one nurse staggered out of his hospital room with a visible sneaker print across her face. Another nurse got knocked unconscious. And it took nearly a dozen people to restrain and sedate this scrawny little kid. He still has a violent phobia of having needles anywhere other than his hands. And even then usually needs sedatives. The only real exception is putting his insulin pump line into his stomach. I had a patient while I was in the AF who tried to commit suicide by taking a rotating saw to his neck. When that was unsuccessful, how I still don't actually understand. He then wandered 3 miles into the woods hoping to just slowly bleed to death. Wife found the blood. Called the base cops. We ended up finding him just wandering around in a daze. He lived. Craziest shit I ever saw. Ended up seeing him a few months later when he came into the facility for a follow-up and stopped in to see the ER staff that night. He was very apologetic and couldn't even remember why he tried to kill himself. Kid came in with a pencil through his hand. Very little blood or signs of distress. I think he was more excited about getting to keep the X-ray than the fact I removed it. Okay. First comment ever. Years ago working as an EDDR. Had a dad bring his 3-year-old daughter in. They'd been eating pizza and she started choking. He opened her mouth and saw a red lump in the back of her throat. So he stuck his finger in and hoiked it out, followed by some fairly brisk bleeding, which had stopped by the time they came in. He brought the 3 centimeter diameter piece of meat with him in a handkerchief, but it didn't appear to be from the pizza they were eating. I had a look in this happy little girl's throat without a problem. Yep. Only one tonsil to be seen. The other was in the hanky. A drunk redneck cutting logs with a chainsaw. He had the chainsaw still in his leg when he got here. It was stuck in his foot, in his shin, and in his calf. He was so drunk he was trying to get out of the wheelchair and calling everyone random slurs. Saved everything somehow. A year later his wife and her sister in the hospital. They had tried to start a bonfire with gasoline. Poured it on the pile of wood while smoking. They exploded themselves. And jumped into a stagnant pond. Burns in 90% of their bodies. And extreme infections. One lost a leg. My dad might qualify as one of these cases. I'm going to preface this with the fact my dad did a lot of hard drugs at this time. His favorite being coke. Which most likely contributed to the story. My dad had been in a car with friends when the driver drove off of a cliff, intentionally or unintentionally has never been specified when my dad tells it. Thanks to my dad's lack of belief in seat belts at the time he was thrown from the car, which caused his eye to pop out of the socket. The ER eventually got him and had to pop it back in. The eye in question is now a lazy eye, but he can still see out of it. I've seen pictures of my dad before this point and it wasn't a lazy eye prior to this accident. Only after. My brother cracked his skull on ice and was taken to ER when he was young. I remember it vividly. My brother getting knocked over by another skater. Him crying and getting medical attention. My confusion. Reassurance from others that my brother was going to be okay. He got taken away in an ambulance. Along with one of my parents. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to come. And a few years later I found one of our fish dead on the counter beside the fish tank. I thought, how the hell did that happen? And it was then that I realized that it had committed suicide by jumping out of a hole in the top of the tank. Not a nurse, but I thought I'd share. When I was 5 my dad got into a really bad accident on his moped involving a car that just wasn't paying attention. My mom worked at the ER but wasn't working that day. Obviously they called her in and I went with. The accident left my dad's elbow bent in the exact opposite way it was meant to be bent. I will never forget my dad's screams when they had to set it back the right way. I worked in ARN for a few days a few weeks back. We had a guy come into Resus who had drunk driven and crashed his car. He had then exited his car and run through a forest for about 50 meters before proceeding to fall 30+ feet down a quarry. Fair to say there wasn't much of his skeleton which wasn't broken after that. Did have the cheek to ask whether he would be going home that night when he first came in, lol. Really late to the party. So this will likely get buried. Not in the medical profession. But I'm a forensic psychologist who works in prisons. One guy was so imaginative with his self-harm that he's now used as an example in officer training. There were so many things he did to harm himself that I couldn't list them all here. But the one I'll never forget was when he used the plastics from a packet of Tim Tams to slice his scrotum. then patiently waited until his 1 hour per day time in the exercise yard to grab a fly and somehow managed to not let the officers see it even though he was handcuffed hands and feet. He then inserted the flying into his scrotum and held the wound shut until his sack was crawling with maggots. Had a middle-aged guy come in one evening and tell me that he had been struck in the testicles by a large pipe when it came loose from a workbench. It was busy but I had a bad feeling about it and got him back to room. I tell him to get on the bed and drop his drawers and I can smell the blood. His testicles were outside of his scrotum. I asked how he was not covered in blood and he said that he had driven home, changed clothes, and only came to the ER after prodding from his wife. He went to surgery and was fine. No hard part damage. Just the skin. Had a guy rush in saying his brother had been blown up. He opted to drive him in because he foolishly assumed that would be quicker and safer than calling an ambulance. Go out and get the guy out of the car. And he looks like those Looney Tunes characters when an explosion backfires. We ended up having to put his armband on his foot. Because his hands were literally melting off his arms. Just a few bones here and there. Surprisingly, he was relatively calm and lucid. Endorphins are a hell of a thing. When we asked what happened, he said his oil tank in the truck exploded. I don't like to generalize, but our demographic tends to dabble in the meth scene. So we assumed it was a meth house casualty. Edit. He looked like this.